He was a single dad, with only a few dollars left, just trying to give his son a warm meal. But when the waitress accidentally gave him too much change, his simple act of honesty caught the attention of a woman who wasn't just a waitress, she was a lonely billionaire in disguise, testing the world for one good person, and she was about to change his life forever. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment where in the world you are watching from. The old truck shuddered as Leo eased it into the gravel parking lot of the diner, the engine giving a final, weary sigh before falling silent. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the whisper of the wind against the cracked windshield and the quiet, rhythmic breathing of his son, Sam, asleep in the passenger seat. Leo leaned his forehead against the cold steering wheel, the worn plastic pressing a faint pattern into his skin. He closed his eyes for a moment, just one moment, to gather the frayed edges of himself. The fuel gauge had been resting on empty for the last 20 miles, a silent, persistent threat that hummed beneath the floorboards. In his wallet, tucked into the worn leather fold, were two bills, a 10 and a 5. $15. That was it. That was all that stood between them and the vast indifferent emptiness of the highway that stretched out behind them and the uncertain road that lay ahead. He had promised Sam a real dinner tonight. Not another gas station sandwich, not the last of the crackers from the bag crumpled under the seat, but a warm meal. On a real plate, in a place with 4 walls and a roof that didn't leak. It was a small promise, the kind most fathers made without a second thought. But for Leo, it felt like hoisting a mountain. He turned his head slowly, careful not to wake the boy. Sam's face, soft and serene in sleep, was a stark contrast to the worry etched into Leo's own. At 8 years old, Sam still had that untarnished belief in the world, a faith that his dad could fix anything: a flat tire, a broken toy, a hungry stomach. Leo felt the weight of that faith like a physical presence in the cab of the truck. It was his anchor and his heaviest burden. He had been a good provider. Once. Before the factory closed, before his wife Sarah decided that a life of making do wasn't a life at all, before the savings dwindled from a respectable cushion to this last, lonely $15. He didn't blame her, not really. He just missed the version of himself that had existed when she was there, the man who hadn't had to count every single coin. The diner's sign, a faded red cursive that simply read, "Eat," flickered weakly against the bruised twilight sky. It was the kind of place you didn't choose, you ended up at. A port in a storm of long drives and longer odds. Leo took a deep breath, the air cold and thin in his lungs. He could do this. For Sam, he could walk in there, order the cheapest thing on the menu for them to share, and make it feel like a celebration. He would smile, he would laugh, he would pretend that the $15 in his pocket was nothing more than pocket money, easily spent and easily replaced. He would be the father his son believed him to be, even if it was just for 1 hour. He reached over and gently shook Sam's shoulder. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. "We're here." Sam stirred, his eyes fluttering open, still clouded with sleep. He blinked, taking in the faint glow of the diner sign, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. "Pancakes?" he asked, his voice filled with a hope so pure it almost broke Leo's heart. Leo managed a smile back, a little cracked at the edges but real enough. "We'll see what they've got, slugger. Let's go." He tucked the $15 into the front pocket of his jeans, the crisp edges of the bills, a sharp reminder of the razor-thin line they were walking. As he opened the truck door, the wind hit him, sharp and unforgiving, but he pulled his worn flannel jacket tighter and walked around to help his son, his shadow stretching long and tired in the fading light. The bell above the diner door gave a cheerful, almost defiant jingle as they stepped inside, a sound that seemed too bright for the weary quiet of the place. The air hung thick with the smell of old coffee, sizzling bacon, and something less tangible, the faint, lingering scent of 1,000 stories told over chipped mugs and checkered tablecloths. It was warmer inside, a comforting blanket of heat that immediately began to soothe the chill from their bones. The diner was a relic from another time, a capsule of chrome and faded red vinyl. The booths were cracked in the corners, the Formica countertops worn smooth by decades of elbows and spilled sugar. A handful of patrons were scattered throughout. A trucker, hunched over a plate of meatloaf at the counter, an elderly couple sharing a slice of pie in a corner booth, their heads bent close together in a silent conversation that had likely lasted 50 years. No one looked up. In a place like this, everyone was just passing through, their loneliness a shared, unspoken password. Leo guided Sam toward a booth by the window, the vinyl cool and slick beneath their hands. He slid in, his body sinking into the worn springs, and watched as Sam scrambled in opposite him, his small legs swinging excitedly beneath the table. The boy's eyes were wide, taking in every detail: the little jukebox selector on the wall, the paper placemat with its maze and fun facts, the metal napkin dispenser that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. To Sam, this wasn't a last resort, it was an adventure. And seeing that look on his son's face, Leo felt a sliver of the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. He could do this. A woman emerged from the swinging doors of the kitchen, a notepad in her hand. She moved with a quiet, unhurried grace that seemed at odds with the clatter and grease of a diner. She wasn't young, but not old either. Her hair was tied back in a simple, no-nonsense ponytail, and her face, free of makeup, had a kind of calm beauty that was easy to overlook. She wore a standard-issue waitress uniform, a pale blue dress with a white apron, but she wore it with a kind of dignity, as if it were a costume she had chosen for a very specific role. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of gray, landed on them, and she offered a small, tired smile. "Evenin'," she said, her voice softer than Leo expected. "What can I get for you two tonight?" She placed 2 glasses of water on the table, along with a menu whose plastic cover had yellowed with age. Leo took it, his hands feeling rough and clumsy against the smooth surface. He scanned the prices, his eyes moving down the columns with a practiced, anxious speed. Burger and fries, $8.95. Chicken fried steak, $11.5. His heart sank a little. He kept scanning, looking for the breakfast section, the haven of the budget-conscious. There it was. 2 eggs, toast, and hash browns. $6.75. He could make that work. He could order one for them to share. He'd say he wasn't hungry, that he'd eaten earlier. A familiar lie, one he had gotten good at telling. "Dad, can I have a cheeseburger?" Sam asked, pointing a small finger at the menu he couldn't yet read. "Please? With extra pickles?" Leo looked at his son, at the hopeful light in his eyes, and then back at the prices. A cheeseburger was $7.5. Add fries, and it was nearly $10. That would leave them with just enough for a gallon or 2 of gas. It was a risk, a stupid one. But the thought of telling Sam no, of seeing that light in his eyes dim, was a heavier weight than the thought of an empty tank. "Sure, buddy," Leo said, his voice sounding steadier than he felt. "A cheeseburger it is." He looked up at the waitress. "He'll have the cheeseburger and fries, and I'll just have a coffee." The waitress, Clara, jotted it down, but her eyes lingered on Leo for a moment. It wasn't a look of pity, but of something else. Observation. Like she was seeing more than just a man ordering dinner. Like she was reading the story behind the words. "You sure that's all for you?" she asked gently. "You look like you could use a warm meal." Leo felt a flush of pride and embarrassment creep up his neck. "I'm fine," he said, a little too quickly. "Ate a big lunch." She nodded, not pushing, but the look in her eyes didn't change. She just tore the slip from her notepad and turned toward the kitchen, her quiet footsteps a soft retreat in the humming silence of the diner. The food arrived on heavy ceramic plates, the kind that felt indestructible. Sam's cheeseburger was a glorious, greasy masterpiece, cheese melting down the sides of the patty, a mountain of golden fries piled high next to it. He dove in with an enthusiasm that was pure joy, his small hands barely big enough to hold the bun. Leo watched him, a slow smile spreading across his face, the warmth of his son's happiness a more potent fuel than any coffee. He sipped the dark, bitter liquid from his mug, letting it burn a trail down his throat, and told himself this was enough. The waitress Clara, Her name tag read, in simple, stitched letters, moved through the diner with a practiced economy of motion. She refilled the trucker's coffee without being asked, cleared the elderly couple's plates with a quiet word, and wiped down the counter until it gleamed. She never seemed to rush, yet nothing was ever left undone. Leo found himself watching her when Sam wasn't looking. There was a stillness about her, a self-contained quality that felt different from the weary resignation of most roadside waitresses. It was in the way she held her shoulders, the straightness of her back, the deliberate way her hands moved. It was as if she were performing a role she had studied meticulously, every gesture perfected. She came back to their table to top off his coffee, her gaze falling on his empty side of the booth. "You know," she said, her voice low, almost a secret, "the cook made an extra order of biscuits and gravy. It's just going to go to waste if someone doesn't eat it. No charge." She didn't wait for his answer, just turned and disappeared into the kitchen again. A minute later, she returned with a small plate, steam rising from a fluffy biscuit smothered in thick, peppery gravy. She set it in front of him with a look that dared him to refuse. "Eat," she said softly, then walked away before he could form the words to say no. Leo stared at the plate. His stomach rumbled in betrayal. Pride warred with a hunger so deep it was an ache in his bones. He looked at Sam, who was happily dunking a fry into a puddle of ketchup, completely oblivious. He looked at the plate, and then he picked up the fork. The gravy was rich and savory, the biscuit soft and warm. It was the most delicious thing he had tasted in months. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, the warmth spreading through him, chasing away not just the cold, but some of the gnawing worry that lived permanently in his gut. When the check came, he saw she hadn't added the coffee or the biscuits. The total was just $8.12 for the cheeseburger and the tax. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the 10 and the 5. He placed them on the small black tray, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second. This was it, the last of it. Clara came by to collect it. "I'll be right back with your change," she said, her eyes meeting his for a brief, unreadable moment. He just nodded, his throat suddenly too tight to speak. He watched her walk to the register, her back straight, her movements unhurried. He started to pull on his jacket, getting ready to leave, to get back to the cold truck and the uncertain road. Sam was starting to yawn, the initial thrill of the diner giving way to a comfortable, food-induced sleepiness. Clara returned to the table and placed the little black tray back down in front of Leo. On it lay a neat stack of bills and a few coins. Leo looked down, expecting to see a few singles and some change. Instead, he saw a $20 bill, a 10, and a 5, along with the coins. She had given him back $35 and change from a $15 payment. A $20 mistake. His heart stopped. He stared at the money, his mind racing. $20. That wasn't just gas money. That was a full tank. That was groceries for 3 days. That was a night in a cheap motel with a real bed and a hot shower. It was a life raft, a miracle. A mistake. Leo's first instinct was a jolt of pure, unadulterated relief. It flooded through him so fast and so hot, it almost made him dizzy. $20. It was an answer to a prayer he hadn't even dared to whisper. He could feel the weight on his shoulders lighten, the knot in his stomach loosen its grip. For a fleeting second, the road ahead didn't look so dark and endless. He could just scoop up the money, tuck it into his pocket, and walk out. She wouldn't even notice until she cashed out at the end of her shift, and by then, he and Sam would be 100 miles away, a ghost. Just another customer passing through. No one would ever know. He could almost feel the worn texture of the $20 bill in his hand, the promise it held. He glanced at Sam, who was now dozing, his head resting against the cool vinyl of the booth, a faint smudge of ketchup at the corner of his mouth. This money wasn't just for him. It was for Sam. It was for a warm bed. It was for a proper breakfast tomorrow, not just toast. It was a buffer against the harsh reality that was always nipping at their heels. Who wouldn't take it? Who, in his position, would be foolish enough to give it back? The thought was seductive, a siren song of ease in a life defined by struggle. But then, another feeling crept in, quieter but more persistent. A slow, creeping shame. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and stained with grease from a life of honest work. He thought of the lessons his own father had taught him, lessons about character being the only thing a man truly owns. He thought about the man he wanted Sam to see when he looked at him. Was he a man who took what wasn't his? Who capitalized on a simple mistake? The relief began to curdle, replaced by a dull, heavy ache in his chest. The $20 bill on the tray no longer looked like a miracle. It looked like a test. And he knew, with a certainty that was both a burden and a relief, that it was a test he couldn't afford to fail. His gaze drifted across the diner to where Clara was wiping down a booth, her back to him. She wasn't watching. She trusted him. Or maybe she hadn't even realized her error. It didn't matter. What mattered was the choice in front of him. He could take the money and run, and a part of his life would be easier for a few days. Or he could give it back, and his life would remain just as hard as it was when he walked in, but his conscience would be clear. He would still be the man Sam believed him to be, the man he wanted to be. He took a slow, deep breath, the decision settling in his bones, heavy but right. He carefully gathered the bills, the crisp edges of the 20 feeling foreign and wrong in his hand. He left a single dollar on the table as a tip more than he could afford, but it felt necessary. Then he gently nudged Sam awake. "Come on, buddy," he whispered. "Time to go." Sam blinked sleepily and slid out of the booth. Leo took his hand, his grip a little tighter than usual, and walked toward the counter, his heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. The trucker had left, and the diner was nearly empty now, the air filled with the low hum of the coolers and the quiet ticking of a clock on the wall. Clara looked up as they approached, a questioning look in her clear, gray eyes. She was standing by the register, her arms folded. She looked calm, poised, as if she had been waiting. Leo stopped in front of her, the money held out in his hand. "I think you made a mistake," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He laid the bills on the counter, smoothing the 20 out with his thumb. "You gave me too much change." Clara looked down at the money on the counter, then back up at Leo. Her expression didn't change, not at first. There was no flicker of surprise, no dawning realization of an error. Her gaze was steady, intense, and deeply analytical, as if she were seeing right through him, past the worn jacket and the tired lines around his eyes, and into the very core of his character. For a long, silent moment, the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the soft, sleepy sigh from Sam, who was leaning against his father's leg. Leo felt exposed under her scrutiny. His simple act of honesty laid bare on the counter between them. He had expected a quick thank you, a moment of flustered gratitude, and then they would be on their way. He hadn't expected this quiet, profound stillness, this feeling of being weighed and measured. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice soft, almost a whisper. It wasn't a real question. It was part of the test. He knew it then. Leo just nodded. "I gave you a 10 and a 5. You gave me back 35, and change." He pushed the bills a little closer to her, wanting the transaction to be over, wanting to escape the intensity of her gaze. "My son and I, we appreciate the meal. The biscuits were great." He tried to keep his tone light, to deflect the weight of the moment, but his voice was tight. He felt Sam's small hand squeeze his, a silent offering of support. Clara finally looked away from him, down at the money. She reached out and slowly, deliberately, separated the $20 bill from the others. She held it between her fingers for a second, then slid it back across the counter toward him. "No," she said, "it wasn't a mistake." Leo stared at her, confused, his brow furrowed. "I don't understand." "I know you don't," she said, and for the first time a real smile touched her lips. It was small, and a little sad, but it reached her eyes, transforming her face from that of a tired waitress into someone else entirely. "Let's just call it a finder's fee. For honesty, it's a rare commodity these days." Leo shook his head, pushing the bill back toward her. "I can't take that," I didn't do anything special. I just gave you back what was yours. Didn't you? She countered, her voice still quiet, but gaining a new kind of strength. You have a child to feed. Your truck looks like it's seen better days. You have $15 to your name. Leo stiffened, a cold wave of anger and shame washing over him. How could she know that? Had she been watching that closely? How did you— I'm observant. She cut him off gently, before his pride could fully ignite. I see people. And I see a man who is struggling but who would rather go hungry than take something that isn't his. A man who is trying to teach his son what it means to be good in a world that doesn't always reward it. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with his. That's not nothing special, Leo. That's everything. The use of his first name, which he hadn't told her, was another small shock, but it was lost in the larger impact of her words. She saw him, not as a charity case, not as a down-on-his-luck drifter, but as a man of character. The anger receded, replaced by a raw, disarming vulnerability. He didn't know what to say. He just stood there, his defenses crumbling under the quiet weight of her recognition. Sam looked up at him, then at Clara, his young face a canvas of confusion and curiosity. Is the money magic, Daddy? He whispered. Leo looked down at his son, then back at the woman behind the counter. He finally met her eyes, and in their clear gray depths he saw something he hadn't seen in a very long time: respect. No, buddy, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. It's not magic. He looked at Clara. But maybe you are. The diner, once a simple refuge from the road, now felt charged with an unspoken significance. The air was thick with questions Leo was afraid to ask, and answers Clara seemed hesitant to give. He should have just taken his son and left, back to the familiar hardship of their life. But he was rooted to the spot, held there by the gravity of her strange, unnerving kindness. He couldn't accept the money, but he couldn't just walk away either. It felt like leaving a story in the middle of a chapter. Clara seemed to understand his paralysis. She broke the silence, her tone shifting from intense to something softer, more practical. It's late, she said, glancing at Sam, who was now rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. And it's cold out there. The old motel attached to the diner. It's not much, but the rooms are clean and the heaters work. Why don't you two stay the night? On the house. Leo's pride flared instantly. We can't accept that. We don't take charity. It's not charity, she countered smoothly, already reaching under the counter and pulling out a small, old-fashioned brass key. It's an investment, in a good man. Consider it a thank you for reminding me that people like you still exist. She held the key out, her gaze unwavering. One night, no strings, just a warm bed for your son. The mention of Sam was a calculated move, and it landed perfectly. Leo looked down at his son, whose small body was starting to droop with exhaustion. The thought of him sleeping in the cold, cramped cab of the truck when a warm bed was being offered, it was a thought he couldn't bear. The fight went out of him, replaced by a weary resignation. He took the key, his calloused fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. The contact sent a small, unexpected jolt through him. Room 3, she said. It's at the end. The lock sticks a little. You have to jiggle it. He nodded, the key feeling heavy and foreign in his palm. Thank you, he mumbled, the words feeling inadequate. Get some rest, Leo, she said, her voice gentle again. As he and Sam walked toward the exit, the jingle of the bells sounding different this time, more like a beginning than an end, Clara's voice stopped him one last time. And Leo? He turned. She was leaning against the counter, a thoughtful expression on her face. My shift ends in an hour. I'll bring by some extra blankets. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. A promise of another interaction, another piece of this unfolding mystery he had stumbled into. He just nodded again and pushed the door open, leading his son out into the cold night, his mind reeling with the impossible turn his evening had taken. He wasn't just a traveler passing through anymore. He was an invited guest in a story he didn't understand, and the author was a quiet waitress with eyes that saw far too much. The motel room was exactly as she'd described it. Not much, but clean. The single room held 2 twin beds with faded floral quilts, a small scarred wooden desk, and a television that looked like it had been manufactured in the last century. But the air was warm, a steady, blissful heat pouring from the old wall unit, and the low, humming sound was the most comforting music Leo had heard in weeks. He set his single duffel bag on the floor and watched as Sam immediately launched himself onto the nearest bed, bouncing once before burrowing under the covers with a contented sigh. "It's soft, Dad," he exclaimed, his voice muffled by the pillow. "And it doesn't smell like old French fries." Leo managed a chuckle, the tension he'd been carrying all day finally starting to dissolve into the warm, still air of the room. He walked over and sat on the edge of his own bed, the springs groaning in protest. He ran a hand over his face, the events of the last hour replaying in his mind. The change, the key, the woman who knew his name. None of it made sense. He pulled the $20 bill from his pocket. Clara had insisted he take it, tucking it into his jacket pocket with a quiet finality that left no room for argument. He smoothed it out on the quilt, staring at the face of Andrew Jackson. It still felt like a test, but one whose rules he didn't understand. Was she just a kind soul? Or was this something else, something more complicated? A quiet knock came at the door, soft but firm. Leo stood, his heart giving a nervous flutter. He opened it to find Clara standing in the cool night air, a stack of thick, folded blankets in her arms. She had a scarf wrapped around her neck now, and her hair was down, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked different outside the diner's fluorescent glow, softer, younger. "I thought you might need these," she said, holding out the blankets. "It gets colder than you'd think out here at night." He took them, their weight warm and substantial in his arms. "Thanks. You didn't have to." "I wanted to," she replied. She lingered at the door, her arms crossed against the chill, her gaze drifting past him into the simple room. "He looks comfortable," she said, nodding toward Sam, who was already fast asleep. "He is," Leo said quietly. "More than he's been in a long time." The silence stretched between them, not awkward, but filled with a kind of fragile curiosity. "You never told me how you knew my name," Leo said, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Clara's lips curved into a faint, mysterious smile. "You have a work order from Leo's handyman services tucked into the sun visor of your truck. The corner of it is peeking out." Leo blinked, a slow flush creeping up his neck. Of course. It was a simple observation, not an act of clairvoyance. And yet, it didn't fully explain the intensity of her focus, the feeling he had of being seen. "You don't miss much, do you?" he said, a note of grudging admiration in his voice. "I try not to," she said. "It's the small details that tell the real story." She looked like she was about to say more, but then she just shook her head slightly, as if changing her mind. "Good night, Leo." "Good night, Clara," he replied, and watched as she turned and walked back toward the diner, her silhouette disappearing into the darkness, leaving him with a stack of warm blankets and more questions than he had started with. Leo woke the next morning to the unfamiliar sensation of being truly rested. The sun was streaming through a gap in the thin curtains, painting a bright stripe across the faded carpet. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The warmth, the quiet, the absence of the truck's lumpy front seat under his backet was all disorienting. Then the memory of the diner, of Clara, of the key, came rushing back. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. Sam was still asleep, a small lump under the floral quilt, his breathing soft and even. Leo walked to the window and peered out. The parking lot was quiet, bathed in the crisp, clean light of a new day. His old truck looked even more battered and weary in the morning sun. A few yards away, a sleek, dark sedan was parked near the diner's entrance. It hadn't been there last night. It looked expensive, out of place, like a shark in a goldfish pond. He pushed the thought aside and turned his attention back to the room. The reality of his situation settled back in, a familiar weight. The warm room and the comfortable bed were a temporary reprieve, a pause button on a life that was still very much in motion. He still had less than a day's worth of gas and a single $20 bill that felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket. The plan had been to be halfway to Flagstaff by now, where he'd heard there might be construction work. But now? He was in a nameless town, in a borrowed room, tangled up in the orbit of a mysterious waitress. A soft knock at the door startled him. He opened it a crack to find Clara standing there, holding a cardboard tray with 2 steaming styrofoam cups and a small paper bag. She was dressed in jeans and a simple gray sweater, her waitress uniform gone. She looked like a different person, more relaxed, less like she was playing a part. "I thought you might be a coffee-in-the-morning kind of guy," she said with a small smile. "And I brought a donut for your co-pilot." Leo opened the door wider, a silent invitation. "You keep doing this," he said, taking the tray from her. "Doing what?" "Showing up, with things we need." "Maybe I just have good timing," she replied, stepping inside. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the sleeping form of his son. A soft, genuine smile touched her lips. "He sleeps like he doesn't have a care in the world." "He doesn't," Leo said quietly. "That's my job." Clara looked at him then, her gaze direct and searching. "It's a heavy job to do alone." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, and it hit him with a surprising force. He was used to people offering platitudes, or worse, pity. He wasn't used to this quiet, simple acknowledgement of his reality. He just nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. It was good, much better than the diner's usual brew. "So what's your story, Clara?" he asked, changing the subject, trying to regain some footing. "You don't seem like the career, waitress type." Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Doesn't everyone have a chapter they'd rather not read aloud?" she said, her voice light, but her eyes told a different story. "I'm just between chapters right now, taking a break from the city." "What city?" he pressed gently. She looked out the brise window, her gaze landing on the dark sedan. "A loud one," she said, and left it at that. The evasion was clear, but it wasn't harsh, it was guarded. She was a woman with walls, and he was a man who knew better than to try and climb them. But he couldn't deny the curiosity that was growing inside him, a pull toward the enigma of the kind waitress who served up free meals and profound observations in a forgotten diner off a lonely highway. Sam woke up to the smell of coffee and the sight of a powdered donut, and his world was instantly perfect. He sat cross-legged on the bed, munching happily, while Leo tried to figure out their next move. The stay in the motel had been a gift, but it was a one-night gift. He couldn't overstay his welcome, couldn't take advantage of Clara's generosity. The road was waiting, and Flagstaff was still hundreds of miles away. He was packing their few belongings back into the duffel bag when he heard a sharp metallic clatter from the parking lot, followed by a frustrated sigh. He glanced out the window. Clara was standing by the hood of the sleek black sedan, which was now propped open. She was staring at the engine with a look of utter bewilderment, a phone pressed to her ear. A few moments later, she hung up, shaking her head in exasperation. Leo watched for another minute, then zipped up the bag. "Stay here and finish your donut, buddy," he said to Sam. "I'll be right back." He walked out into the cool morning air, his boots crunching on the gravel. He approached the car slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Trouble?" he asked, his voice calm. Clara jumped, turning to face him. A flush of pink crept up her cheeks. "Oh, hi. Yes, my car. It just died. It won't start, and the rental company's roadside assistance is apparently a myth they tell you about to make you feel safe." Leo raised an eyebrow. "Rental?" "Long story," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "The point is, I'm stuck." He stepped closer and peered under the hood. The engine was a complex, pristine work of art, a maze of polished chrome and neatly bundled wires. It was a high-performance machine, the kind he rarely saw outside of magazines. But an engine was an engine. He could see the problem almost immediately. A small, crucial battery cable had come loose from its terminal. It was a simple fix, a 2-minute job for someone with the right tool. "I can fix that," he said, his voice holding the quiet confidence of a man in his element. Clara looked at him, surprised. "You can, but it's complicated." "It's a car," he said with a small shrug. "They're all just nuts and bolts and a little bit of electricity. You got a wrench in the trunk?" She blinked, then a slow smile spread across her face. "I have no idea, but I have a feeling you'll find one." He did. In a ridiculously plush, carpeted trunk, tucked away in a leather-bound toolkit that probably cost more than his entire set of tools back home, he found a small socket wrench. He had the cable reconnected and tightened in less time than it took Clara to find the trunk release. "Try it now," he said, wiping his hands on the back of his jeans. She slid into the driver's seat, the leather sighing softly under her weight, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, a deep, powerful purr that vibrated through the pavement. She looked up at him through the windshield, her expression a mixture of gratitude and something else he couldn't quite decipher. Awe, maybe. She got out of the car, leaving the engine running, and walked over to him. She reached into her purse, a sleek leather accessory that matched the car's interior, and pulled out a wallet. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "Seriously, let me pay you for your time." She started to pull out a bill, but Leo held up a hand, stopping her. "No," he said firmly. "No payment." "But you're a handyman," she protested. "This is what you do." "I fixed a loose wire," he said. "You gave my son a warm bed and a hot meal. Let's call it even." Clara stared at him, her wallet still open in her hand. She looked genuinely stunned, as if the concept of a transaction-free favor was a foreign language she was just beginning to understand. "But—" "No buts," he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Just be more careful with your rentals." He started to turn away, heading back to the motel room to collect his son and get back on the road. "Wait!" she called out. He stopped and looked back at her. "You're leaving, aren't you?" It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. He nodded. "Have to. Got a job prospect in Arizona." "Oh," she said, her voice dropping. The light seemed to fade from her face, leaving her looking lost and surprisingly vulnerable. "Well, drive safe." He watched her for a moment longer, a strange, unwelcome tug in his chest. He didn't want to go. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He didn't want to leave. This quiet diner, this strange, kind woman. But he had to. It was the responsible thing to do. It was the only thing to do. The goodbye was quick and painfully civil. Leo checked out, returning the key to Clara at the front counter of the now empty diner. Sam gave her a fierce, donut crumb-dusted hug, which she returned with a tightness that seemed to hold a world of unspoken words. Leo just gave a nod, a quiet, "Thanks for everything," and then he walked away, forcing himself not to look back. The truck started on the second try, a small mercy. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he caught a glimpse of her in his rearview mirror, a solitary figure standing in the diner doorway, watching them go. He focused on the road, on the white lines that spooled out in front of him, a tangible path away from the complication he was leaving behind. He drove for an hour, then 2. Sam was quiet in the passenger seat, his usual stream of chatter replaced by a thoughtful silence. Leo tried to fill the space with talk of Arizona, of the mountains and the sunshine, but his words felt hollow, his enthusiasm forced. The truth was, his mind was still back at the diner. He kept replaying their conversations, the look in her eyes when he'd returned the change, the feel of her hand when she'd given him the key. He had spent months, years even, building walls around himself, protecting himself and his son from the pain of attachment and loss. He had become an expert at moving on, at not looking back. But Clara had, in less than 24 hours, found a crack in those walls. Her quiet strength, her strange mix of worldly poise and genuine vulnerability, her inexplicable kindness, it had all gotten under his skin in a way he hadn't anticipated and didn't know how to handle. "Dad?" Sam's small voice broke the silence. "Yeah, buddy? Was Miss Clara sad we left?" Leo's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He glanced at his son. Sam was looking at him with those big, perceptive eyes that saw far too much. "I think so," Leo admitted, the truth tasting like rust in his mouth. "Are you sad?" Sam asked, his voice even smaller now. Leo didn't answer right away. He stared at the endless stretch of asphalt, at the unforgiving landscape blurring past his window. Was he sad? Sad wasn't the right word. It was a deeper ache, a feeling of having walked away from something that might have been important, something that might have been real. It was the hollow echo of a missed opportunity. He felt like he'd failed a test he hadn't even known he was taking. "Yeah, buddy," he finally said, his voice rough. "I think I am." Just then the truck's engine gave a violent shudder, a cough that rattled the entire frame. The check engine light, which had been a constant, ignored companion for months, began to flash with a new, frantic urgency. The truck sputtered again, losing speed. Leo pumped the gas, but it was no use. With a final, defeated gasp, the engine died. He coasted to the shoulder of the highway, the silence in the cab now deafening. He turned the key. Nothing. He tried again. Just a sickening click. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes, a dry, humorless laugh escaping his lips. Of course this would happen now. Stranded. In the middle of nowhere, with a sad kid, a broken-down truck, and a $20 bill that now felt more like a souvenir of a life he just walked away from than a solution to any of his problems. The road, it seemed, had other plans for him. Clara stood by the diner window, a dishcloth in her hand, staring out at the empty space in the parking lot where Leo's truck had been. The sleek black sedan was still there, a silent, mocking testament to her own stalled journey. She should have left, too. Her break was turning into something else, something she hadn't planned for. Her real life, with its boardrooms and responsibilities, was waiting. A phantom limb aching with its absence. But the thought of getting back into that car, of driving back to the city and slipping back into the role of Clara Vanderbilt, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar investment firm, felt like putting on a suit of armor that was 2 sizes too small. She had come to this diner, to this forgotten town, as a last-ditch effort to feel something real. She had grown so tired of the calculated kindness of her world, the transactional relationships, the sycophants who agreed with her every word. She'd wanted to see if genuine, unprompted goodness still existed. So she had devised a simple, if perhaps cynical, test. She would be a waitress. She would accidentally give someone struggling an excess of change and see what they did. For 2 weeks, she had been met with a disheartening parade of human nature. People took the money without a second glance. A few hesitated, then pocketed it with a shifty look. No one, not a single person, had returned it. Until Leo. He hadn't just returned the money, he had refused to benefit from her mistake in any way, even when she'd tried to frame it as a reward. He had held onto his dignity with a quiet, stubborn strength that she found both infuriating and breathtaking. He was real, more real than anyone she had met in years, and she had let him drive away. The jingle of the bell on the door made her jump. An old farmer came in, tipping his hat. "Morning, Clara. Just a coffee to go." She turned, forcing a smile, her hands moving on autopilot as she poured the coffee. But as she handed it to him, her eyes drifted back to the window, to the empty highway. A sudden fierce resolve hardened in her chest. She had spent her entire adult life making calculated, strategic decisions based on risk assessment and potential returns. But what was the risk here? A little pride? Another disappointment? It was nothing compared to the potential return, a chance at something authentic. She untied her apron and tossed it onto the counter. She grabbed her purse and the keys to the sedan. She didn't know where he was going, or how far he had gotten, but she knew the direction, and for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't running away from something. She was driving toward it. The drive was a blur of asphalt and sky. She pushed the sedan harder than she should have, the powerful engine eating up the miles. She scanned every rest stop, every gas station, her eyes searching for the familiar battered shape of his truck. An hour passed, then another. A knot of doubt began to tighten in her stomach. Maybe he had gotten farther than she thought. Maybe he had turned off onto a different highway. Maybe she was a fool chasing a ghost, and then she saw it. Pulled over on the shoulder, its hood up like a desperate plea for help. The old, blue and rust truck. Her heart leaped into her throat. She pulled over behind him, the sedan's tires crunching on the gravel. She saw Leo leaning over the engine, his back to her. Sam was sitting on the tailgate, his small shoulders slumped in defeat. She got out of the car, her heels sinking slightly into the soft dirt, and walked toward them, the sound of her own heartbeat loud in her ears. "Having car trouble?" she asked, her voice sounding surprisingly steady. Leo spun around, his face a mask of shock, grease smudged on his cheek. He stared at her as if she were an apparition. "Clara, what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," she said with a small, wry smile. "I thought you were headed to Arizona." "Engine had other plans," he said, his voice rough. He looked exhausted, defeated, and unbearably handsome. "You followed us," he stated, not as a question. "I did," she admitted, her gaze unwavering. "Because I think you left something behind." "I don't have anything left to leave," he said, a bitter edge to his voice. "I think you do," she said softly, taking a step closer. "I think you left me." Leo stared at her, the words hanging in the air between them, more real and more shocking than the dead engine of his truck. "You think I left you?" he repeated, his voice a low growl of disbelief. He gestured around them, at the broken-down vehicle, the endless, empty highway. "Look at this, Clara. This is my life. It's breakdowns and busted parts and never having enough. You think I can just drag someone like you into this?" "Someone like me?" she countered, her voice quiet but firm, her eyes flashing with a fire he hadn't seen before. "You mean someone with money? Someone who lives in a world you've decided you don't belong in? You don't know the first thing about my world, Leo." He let out a harsh laugh. "I know it's not this. I know it doesn't involve sleeping in a truck and praying you have enough gas to make it to the next town." "No," she agreed, taking another step closer, closing the distance between them until only a few feet of dusty gravel remained. "My world involves sleeping in a 10-square-foot penthouse that feels as empty as a tomb. It involves people who smile to your face while they plot to take what you have. It involves a loneliness so profound you start to forget what a real conversation sounds like. So don't you dare stand there and tell me about your struggles as if I couldn't possibly understand what it means to be empty." Her passionate defense left him speechless. He had seen her as a creature of another species, a woman cocooned in wealth and privilege. He had never considered that her cage, while gilded, was a cage nonetheless. The anger in him began to deflate, replaced by a dawning, uncomfortable understanding. Sam had hopped off the tailgate and was now standing a few feet away, watching them with wide, serious eyes. He didn't seem scared, just intensely curious, as if he were watching the two most interesting characters in a movie. "You came back for us," Sam said, a simple statement of fact. Clara's gaze softened as she looked at him. "I did." She then looked back at Leo, her expression pleading. "I'm not asking you to let me fix your life, Leo. I'm asking you to let me be a part of it. The messy, broken, real part. Because it's more real than anything I've had in years." Leo ran a hand through his hair, his defenses warring with a desperate, burgeoning hope. Everything he had told himself about why he had to leave, why they were too different, it all felt like a flimsy excuse in the face of her raw honesty. She wasn't offering pity. She was offering herself. "My truck is dead, Clara," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how I'm going to get to Arizona. I don't know what I'm going to do." "I know," she said softly. "So let's start there. Together." She held out her hand. It was a simple gesture, an offering. Not of money, not of a solution, but of partnership. He looked at her hand, then at her face. He saw the strength there, but he also saw the fear, the vulnerability. She was just as scared as he was. And in that shared fear, he found a strange kind of courage. He reached out and took her hand. His was rough and grease-stained, hers was smooth and delicate, but they fit together perfectly. "Okay," he said, the word feeling like both a surrender and a victory. "Okay." A slow, brilliant smile spread across Clara's face, and in that moment, under the vast open sky, the broken-down truck and the uncertain future didn't seem quite so daunting anymore. They were just two people, holding hands on the side of a lonely highway, about to start a journey they never expected. The decision to trust her was one thing, the logistics were another. The first step was the truck. Clara made a single, quiet phone call. She didn't raise her voice, didn't issue commands. She just spoke in low, calm tones, and within an hour, a flatbed tow truck appeared on the horizon like a chariot from another world. The driver, a burly man with a friendly smile, seemed to know exactly who she was, addressing her as Ms. Vanderbilt with a respectful nod. Leo flinched at the name, another reminder of the chasm between their lives, but Clara didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she ignored it. She simply instructed the driver to take the truck to the best garage in the next major city and to send the bill to her office. Leo tried to protest, but she cut him off with a look. "We're a team now, remember?" she said softly. "Teams help each other out." With the truck gone, the three of them were left with the sleek black sedan. Sam was thrilled, immediately claiming the back seat and marveling at the built-in video screens. Leo, however, felt deeply out of place as he sank into the plush leather of the passenger seat. The car smelled of wealth, of a life he couldn't comprehend. It was a stark, physical reminder of just how different they were. They drove to the nearest town, a small, sleepy place with a single motel that had a glowing vacancy sign. Clara booked 2 adjoining rooms without a second thought, paying with a black credit card that the clerk handled like a holy relic. In the privacy of his own room, which was still a significant step up from their usual accommodations, Leo felt a fresh wave of unease. This was all happening too fast. He was losing control, and control was the only thing that had kept him and Sam afloat for so long. Later that evening they met for dinner at a local family restaurant. It was a cheerful, noisy place, and Sam was in his element, chattering away about the tow truck and the fancy car. But Leo was quiet, withdrawn. He watched Clara interact with his son, saw the genuine warmth and patience in her eyes, and it only made the knot in his stomach tighter. He was starting to care about her, really care. And that terrified him. After they had tucked Sam into bed, Leo found Clara standing on the small balcony outside her room, staring up at the star-dusted sky. "You're quiet tonight," she said, without turning around. "Just a lot on my mind," he replied, leaning against the railing beside her. "Are you regretting this?" she asked, her voice laced with a vulnerability that caught him off guard. He hesitated. "I'm scared," he admitted, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. "I'm scared of what happens when this fairy tale ends. When you go back to being Ms. Vanderbilt, and I go back to being me." Clara finally turned to face him, her expression serious in the dim light. "What if I told you I don't want to go back?" she said. "What if I told you that the woman you think I am, she's the costume? And this," she gestured between them at the quiet night, "this is the first time I've felt real in years." "I don't know if I can believe that," he said honestly. "Then don't believe it," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Just give me a chance to show you." The next few days unfolded in a way that felt both dreamlike and intensely real. The garage called to say that Leo's truck needed a new engine, a repair that would cost thousands of dollars and take at least a week. Leo's heart sank, but Clara was unfazed. "A week," she said, a thoughtful smile on her face. "What are we going to do with a whole week?" She didn't suggest extravagant trips or expensive entertainment. Instead, she led them on a series of simple, quiet adventures. They found a local lake and spent an afternoon skipping stones across the glassy water, Sam's laughter echoing in the clear air. They went to a matinee movie in a tiny, one-screen theater, sharing a giant bucket of popcorn. They spent hours in the local library, where Clara, an avid reader, helped Sam pick out a stack of books, her face animated as she described the plots. Leo watched it all from a slight distance, his fear and his hope locked in a silent battle. He saw how good she was with Sam, how she listened to his endless stories with genuine interest, how she never talked down to him. He saw the way Sam adored her, how he would instinctively reach for her hand when they crossed the street. He was letting her in, this woman who had by all logic no place in their lives. And Leo was letting her in too, despite every instinct that screamed for him to run. One afternoon, while Sam was engrossed in a new comic book, Leo found Clara sitting by the motel pool, sketching in a small notebook. He sat down beside her, and she showed him what she was drawing. They were designs for houses. Small, sustainable, beautifully simple homes. It was a side project, she explained, a little shyly. Something I worked on when I couldn't sleep. I always dreamed of building a community, not just a portfolio. A place where things were made to last. He looked at the drawings, at the intricate details, and saw a side of her he hadn't imagined. She wasn't just a CEO. She was a creator, a dreamer. "They're beautiful," he said, and he meant it. "Thank you," she said, her eyes meeting his. "No one's ever seen these before." In that quiet moment, by the side of a cheap motel pool, another one of Leo's walls crumbled. He was starting to see the woman, not the name. He was starting to see Clara, and the more he saw, the more terrified and the more hopeful he became. The call came on a Thursday morning, an unwelcome intrusion into the fragile bubble of peace they had created. Clara was sitting on the floor of the motel room with Sam, helping him build an elaborate castle out of pillows and blankets, when her phone buzzed with a name she hadn't seen in months. Marcus Thorne, her second-in-command, and the man who ran her empire in her absence. She ignored it. It buzzed again. And again. Finally, with a sigh, she excused herself and stepped outside onto the balcony, closing the sliding glass door behind her. Leo watched her through the glass, his stomach tightening. He saw the shift in her posture, the way she straightened her back, the professional mask that slipped over her face. The waitress was gone. Ms. Vanderbilt was back. "Marcus, what is it?" Her voice was crisp, all business. Leo could only hear her side of the conversation, but it was enough. "No, I'm not coming back yet. I don't care what the board says. The quarterly reports can wait, because I have something more important here." "No, that's none of your business." She was pacing now, a caged tiger in her small, self-imposed exile. "Just handle it, Marcus. That's what I pay you for." She hung up abruptly, her hand gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles were white. She stood there for a long moment, her back to the room, breathing deeply. When she finally turned around, the mask was gone, but in its place was a look of profound sadness and conflict. She slid the door open and stepped back inside. "Sorry about that," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Work stuff." Leo didn't press her. He didn't have to. He had seen it all in her face. Her other life, the one with the boardrooms and the quarterly reports, was not something she could just walk away from. It was a part of her, a powerful, demanding entity that would eventually pull her back. The thought sent a chill through him. The bubble had been pierced. Reality was seeping in. That evening, the mood was different. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by a quiet tension. They ate dinner in near silence. Afterward, while Sam was in the shower, Leo found Clara staring out the motel room window. "You have to go back, don't you?" he said, his voice flat. She didn't deny it. "They need me," she said softly. "There are issues. Things only I can handle." "And what about us?" The question escaped him before he could stop it. "What about this? Clara turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know, Leo," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I honestly don't know." He had known this moment was coming. He had braced himself for it, but the reality of it was a physical blow. She was leaving. The fairy tale was over. "I get it," he said, his voice hard, a protective shell snapping back into place. "You have a life to get back to. A real life." "This was real," she insisted, stepping toward him, her hands reaching out as if to touch him, then falling back to her sides. "Leo, please don't think this wasn't real." But he couldn't hear her. All he could hear was the echo of his wife's voice, the memory of another woman who had chosen another life over the one she had with him. He had been a fool to let his guard down, a fool to believe it could be different this time. "The truck should be ready tomorrow," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We'll be on our way in the morning." He turned and walked away from her, toward the sound of the shower, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the room, the space between them suddenly a vast, uncrossable canyon. The silence in the car, on the way back to the diner, was thicker than any he had ever experienced. It wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a living, breathing entity, pressing in on them from all sides. He had picked up the truck that morning. The engine was new, powerful, and purred like a kitten. The bill, as promised, had been taken care of. It was another debt he owed her, another link in a chain he was desperate to break. They had packed their bags in silence, avoiding each other's eyes. Sam, perceptive as always, had picked up on the shift. He was quiet, his usual bright energy dimmed, his small face a mask of confusion and sadness. Now, as they pulled into the diner's parking lot, the place looked exactly the same, but everything felt different. It was no longer a place of mystery and hope. It was the site of an ending. Clara's sedan was gone. In its place was a different black car, this one with a driver standing beside it, a silent, impassive sentinel. The time had come. Clara got out of the truck, her movements stiff and unnatural. Leo and Sam followed, the three of them standing awkwardly in the gravel lot. "So," Leo said, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "This is it," Clara nodded, her gaze fixed somewhere over his shoulder. "My flight leaves in a few hours." She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a pain that mirrored his own. "Leo, don't," he cut her off, his voice rougher than he intended. "Don't say you're sorry, don't say you'll call. Let's just end it clean." He was being cruel, and he knew it. He was hurting her because he was hurting, and it was the only defense he had left. Clara flinched as if he had struck her. She took a step back, a wall of cool composure descending over her features. The waitress, the dreamer, they were gone. Vanderbilt was back. "Fine," she said, her voice clipped. She knelt down in front of Sam, her movements graceful even in her pain. "Goodbye, Sam," she said, her voice softening. "You be good for your dad, okay?" Sam's lower lip began to tremble. He launched himself at her, wrapping his small arms around her neck in a desperate hug. "Don't go," he whispered into her hair. "Please, don't go." Clara held him tight for a long moment, her eyes squeezed shut. Leo could see her shoulders shaking. When she finally pulled away, her face was a mess of tear-streaked composure. She stood up, not looking at Leo, and walked toward the waiting car. The driver opened the door for her. She got in without a backward glance. The car pulled away, its tires whispering on the asphalt, and disappeared down the highway. Leo stood there, his son sobbing quietly beside him, and watched until it was gone. He had what he wanted, a clean end. But as he looked down at his son's heartbroken face and felt the gaping, hollow space in his own chest, he realized that there was no such thing. He had just traded one kind of pain for another. The next weeks were a study in gray. Leo drove. He drove with a single-minded determination, putting as many miles as possible between them and the diner, between them and her. He took the job in Flagstaff, a grueling, back-breaking construction gig that left him exhausted and sore at the end of each day. It was what he wanted. The physical pain was a welcome distraction from the emotional ache that had taken up permanent residence in his chest. They lived in a small, cramped apartment with paper-thin walls. It was a step up from the truck, but it didn't feel like a home. It was just a place to sleep. Sam was quiet, withdrawn. He didn't talk about Clara, but her absence was a constant presence. He stopped drawing as much. He didn't tell his usual elaborate stories. A light had gone out in him, and Leo knew, with a guilt that was a physical weight, that he was the one who had extinguished it. Leo threw himself into his work, taking on extra shifts, pushing his body to its limit. He told himself he was doing it for Sam, to build a stable life for them. But he knew, in the quiet, honest moments of the night, that he was running. He was trying to outrun a memory, a feeling, a regret so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. He missed her. He missed her quiet strength, her unexpected humor, her searching gray eyes. He missed the woman who had sketched houses by a motel pool, the woman who had laughed with his son over a pillow fort. He had been so focused on their differences, on the worlds that separated them, that he had failed to see the one thing that truly mattered. She had seen him. She had seen him and Sam, and she had wanted to be a part of their messy, imperfect life. His pride, his fear, they had cost him the one thing he hadn't even known he was searching for. One evening, after a particularly long day, he came home to find Sam sitting at the small kitchen table, staring at a piece of paper. It was a drawing. A simple, childlike sketch of 3 stick figures: a man, a boy, and a woman. They were holding hands. Above them, a crudely drawn sun was smiling. "I miss her, Dad," Sam said, his voice small and fragile. Leo sank into the chair opposite him, the exhaustion of the day, of the weeks, crashing over him. He looked at the drawing, at the 3 smiling figures, and something inside him broke. His walls, his pride, his fear, they all came crashing down. "Me too, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Me too." He had made a mistake. A terrible, life-altering mistake. And in that moment, looking at his son's drawing, he knew he had to try and fix it. He didn't know if it was too late. He didn't know if she would even want to hear from him. But he had to try. For Sam, and for himself. The decision to go back was the easiest one Leo had made in his life. The execution was harder. He didn't have a phone number for her, an address, a last name he was even sure of. Vanderbilt, the tow truck driver had called her. He started there. He spent a whole Saturday at the local library, Sam sitting patiently beside him, and he searched. It didn't take long. Clara Vanderbilt. The name was everywhere. CEO of Vanderbilt Capital. Philanthropist. Business prodigy. There were photos of her at galas, on the cover of magazines, shaking hands with powerful people. She looked poised, confident, untouchable. It was the woman he had met, and yet it was a complete stranger. His heart sank. How could he, a construction worker from Flagstaff, possibly reach a woman like that? He almost gave up then. The chasm between their worlds seemed more like a galaxy. But then he found a small article, buried deep in the business section of an old newspaper archive. It was about her father, the founder of the company. It mentioned that he had started the family's first business, a small chain of diners, in a handful of forgotten towns across the Southwest. The article listed the original locations. One of them was a tiny dot-on-the-map town in New Mexico, the town where they had met. She hadn't been there by accident. She had gone back to the beginning. Hope, fragile but fierce, surged through him. He quit his job the next day. He packed their few belongings back into the truck, which now ran like a dream. He told Sam they were going on an adventure. And for the first time in weeks, he saw that familiar, bright light return to his son's eyes. The drive back was different. He wasn't running from something. He was driving toward it. He didn't know what he would say, what he would do. He just knew he had to show up. He had to tell her the truth, that he was a fool, that he was scared, and that he was in love with her. When they finally pulled into the diner's parking lot, his heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The diner looked the same. The eat sign was still flickering. But her sedan was gone. A cold dread washed over him. Was he too late? Had she moved on? He got out of the truck, his legs feeling unsteady. He took Sam's hand, and together they walked toward the diner door. The bell jingled, a sound that now felt like fate. The diner was empty, save for one person. Clara. She was sitting in their booth, the one by the window, a cup of coffee in front of her. She was staring out the window, a sad, lost look on her face. She looked up as the bell rang, and her eyes widened in shock. She stood up slowly, her hand going to her mouth. "Leo?" she whispered, as if he were a ghost. He walked toward her, his heart in his throat. "I'm sorry," he said, the words tumbling out. "I was an idiot. I was scared. I let my pride get in the way of the best thing that has ever happened to me." He stopped in front of the booth, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't care about the money, Clara. I don't care about the name. I care about you. And if you'll have us, we're not going anywhere." Tears were streaming down Clara's face, but she was smiling. A real, brilliant, beautiful smile. "I was hoping you'd say that," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Sam ran forward and wrapped his arms around her waist, and she hugged him tight, burying her face in his hair. Then she looked up at Leo, her eyes shining. "Welcome home," she said. And for the first time in a very long time, he was.